Just one more quick announcement. I know that we have some openings on our cleaning teams. If you'd be interested in donating just a couple hours, give them a couple hours a month to jump in on one of those cleaning teams. Leon's going to be at the FYI counter afterwards, so please go see him. RD, everybody look at the guy on the camera. Because today's his big 4-0 birthday, right? RD, is that a couple digits higher on the first one there? Is that the... The big 6-0. All right, but RD, you're looking good, buddy. And you're the only one that's not on camera, so we got to give you a little bit of love there. Well, the tech guys, they're always good looking though back there. So, yeah. You too, Steve. So I don't know how many of you saw it. We put out on Facebook that I had a big announcement to make today. We have been in this transition with moving out of my role as lead pastor here. How many of you were here a month ago when we spent that time together as a church family, not knowing for sure what God was doing and when that was going to open up for what was next? It came quicker than I expected. I have been hired on as the new director of advancement for Destiny Rescue. So, you guys, our heart as a church family for, Kids Alive and Destiny Rescue through the years. And to be honest, years ago, I would have thought for sure somewhere down the line, I would have ended up doing something with Kids Alive. I thought for sure that was probably something that was coming up, whether that was here in the States or going and serving in the Dominican Republic or something. I thought, yeah, that'll probably happen at some point. But God just made that really clear through some conversations that wasn't the direction. And you remember, so you guys were here during the Sync series. That was the big thing for me, was in this process, was I obviously I love Destiny Rescue. Destiny Rescue loves our church family and what this church family does. And I don't think this church family quite understands how unique it is. For the size that we are, the involvement level and the rescues that we have done, this church family gets talked about all over the country by people who work with Destiny Rescue. They know about this church family. It's an amazing place. Obviously, I'm a little biased. That's okay. I'm guessing you are too. So when I talked with them and they expressed an interest, I said, I would love if you guys, I so desperately want this not just to be because I love what you do and love your organization. I want this to be something that makes sense, that this is something about what I love to do and what my giftedness is and what you need. And I need this, not just something that just, we love each other. It's got to be more than that. And they came back and they shared an idea and we went back and forth on this a little bit and it was just right. So how many of you feel like you know my heart pretty well? You've been here long enough to know my heart pretty well, okay? So this is my primary stuff that I'm going to be doing. How many of you follow them on Facebook? Did you see the post this past week? Yeah. 64 kids rescued this past week. 64 kids rescued this past week. Unbelievable. And you remember, if you started following them when we started partnering with them as a church 4 years ago, a lot of times you'd see like 2 kids rescued, 1 kid. Sometimes a number of times you'd see 0 kids rescued. And that was just 4 years ago. And this organization is just exploding as people are becoming aware of it and getting invested in it. And churches like ours are just pouring themselves into this thing, that we're going to be easily over 1,000 rescues this year alone. And that's such a cool, awesome God thing. And what an honor to be able to be a part of that. So what I'm going to do is, as the organization continues to get bigger and gets a bigger national presence, I'm going to be one of their 3 speakers that will represent them at national events throughout the country. I'm going to take either 1 or 2 teams every year to Cambodia and Thailand for a 2-week trip. And that's the face-to-face. We go down to the red light district in all of its ugliness. We're going to be going to the rescue homes. We're going to be meeting undercover agents who go in and do this. We're going to meet the rescue workers who go in, some of these ex-military people that go in and are part of this rescuing these kids. We're going to get to go to the homes and talk to the kids and hear their stories. We're going to get to go to the coffee houses and the hair salons where these gals are starting to learn an occupation so they can support themselves to keep them away from ever having to resort to that again. It's going to be that real face-to-face encounter, and I love that. That's what we've loved about going to the Dominican is the face-to-face encounter. You got to make it real. But what was the clincher for me was, one, it means we don't have to move. We're staying right here in Goshen. So that means so much to us. The other part of that is this is what I get to, my day-to-day stuff that they want me to do. And I'm like, this is really what I get to concentrate on all the time. They're like, yeah, we want you to coach pastors, churches, and volunteers in Northeast Indiana on how to engage their churches with Destiny Rescue. That's what I get to do. They're saying we're looking at CCW and what you guys as a church family have done, and we want to see you help other pastors duplicate that all over the place. So we have churches all over the place that are being talked about as much as CCW is being talked about in Destiny Rescue. So that's the thing that I love about this is I'm not going to be your lead pastor for much longer, but I am taking the story of CCW with me. And I get to do this because of what this church family has done. In a sense, you're basically sending out a local missionary is kind of what you're doing here. You're taking the story of what we have come to love about Destiny Rescue, and you're allowing that to get duplicated all over the place. So I thank you for that. I thank you for being a part of my life. I thank you for being a part of helping this come about, because that's all getting birthed out of what this family is. And I love you guys so much for that. And I thank you for that. So, I did come prepared this time. Last time I wasn't very well prepared, but this time I was talking to Mark. Mark was standing in the back there. I'm like, dude, I'm getting emotional back here just thinking about telling everybody this here. So we'll keep you posted with that. I know the kind of the rough ballpark framework is probably beginning of February, so I'm still going to be with you guys through the end of January, and that was kind of the time frame we talked about even before I knew what was next. What are you saying, Randy? You're just saying I'm just a big baby up here? Thank you. So, for a couple months now, we have been doing this series called Used, Common People in the Hands of an Uncommon God. People who are broken and messed up like you and me, yet they are the same people that God uses to do amazing things. And we can all relate to that, can't we? Who else here is a messed up, broken person? Anybody? Yeah, we're in good company, aren't we? 2 hands. Great, 2 hands. Today we're going to take a look at the life of Joseph, Old Testament Joseph. He is one of my favorite people from the Bible. And Joseph is one of those Bible characters that, we could easily do like a 5-6 week study on him because there is so much that we can learn from his example. But today we're going to take a look, kind of a quick overview of his life so you can see how this relative of ours, because that's what he is. He's gone before us in the faith journey. He's a Christ follower, so he's a relative of ours. We're going to see how this relative of ours fits into the big story of God and how it connects with our stories today as well. And as we look at Joseph's life and story, I want you to keep this thought in mind. Even when God feels far away, he is always by your side. Did you say that with me? Even when God feels far away, he is always by your side. Now let me give you a little bit of background to set up what happened in our faith history leading up to the life of Joseph, which is found in the very first book of the Bible called Genesis. And what we see when we're reading the book of Genesis is that God is building up a nation for himself, a group of people that are going to be an example to the rest of the world of what it looks like to wholeheartedly follow after him. We call that the church today. And he starts with Abraham and Sarah. They have a baby in their 90s, which should be on all of your bucket list. The baby is named Isaac. And when Isaac is a teenager, God instructs Abraham to do something that at first makes absolutely no sense. God tells Abraham to take Isaac up Mount Moriah and sacrifice him to God. And later we see it was an opportunity for Abraham to show God how much he trusted him, and God had no intentions of Isaac being sacrificed. Instead, God provides a substitute. He provides a ram to be sacrificed in his place. And this event would point to the event that would take place a little over 2,000 years later, when on the exact same mountain where the future city of Jerusalem would be built, God would provide another substitute to be sacrificed when he allowed his one and only son, Jesus, to be crucified on our behalf. So Abraham and Sarah had Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah had a son named Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons, one of which was Joseph, who's the focus of our learning together this morning. And you've heard me talk about this before, that when we look at the world around us, we have to recognize there's a big picture and there's a little picture, or maybe you've heard me refer to it as the upper story and the lower story. You and I live in the lower story. Our perspective is so limited on everything that we do, everything we experience, everything that we're about on a day-to-day basis. God sees everything from an upper story perspective. He sees how it all goes together. He sees so much more than we possibly can. He sees the big overall plan. It's the big vision of God that sees where it all began, where everything is going, and how it all ends. And God's big vision for the creation of the heavens and the earth was to extend community to us, to be with us. But a choice was made in the beginning. It's the same one that we would make if we had been in that situation. A choice was made to do our own thing and go our own way instead of God's. And as a result, a sin nature has been passed down from generation to generation to the present day that leads people to choose their own way over God's from birth. It separates us from God. And the rest of the Bible is the story of the extent to which God will go to get us back. And we read about that in John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. And finally, in the last two chapters of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, it talks about God creating a new heaven and a new earth where those who have placed their trust in his son will dwell with him forever. I just gave you in like 30 seconds an overview of the entire Bible. So let's talk about Joseph. Joseph was one of 12 boys. Anybody come from a large family? Lots of siblings? Anybody have that many siblings? Do I see a hand up back there? Yvette, how many siblings? 12. I'm not really sure how to respond to that. Wow, that's awesome. So one of 12 boys, and he was his father's favorite. Now, how many of you were daddy's favorite? Anybody? Yvette, you got your hand up out of 12. You really think you were the favorite? Are you sure? All right. So the story that we read about Joseph today, it picks up when Joseph is 17 years old. And Joseph is given by his dad this coat of many colors, this beautiful, extravagant coat that he flaunted in front of all of his brothers. And he had dreams about his brothers and his father bowing down to him, worshiping him, serving him. Let me give you a little bit of practical advice. If you have those kinds of dreams, don't share them with your siblings. All right? That's stupid. And as you would expect, eventually the brothers have had enough. One day, Joseph goes out to visit them as they're looking after the sheep, and some of the brothers wanted to kill him. They were so irritated with him. But the oldest, named Reuben, convinced the rest of them to throw him in a nearby cistern. And the cistern would be like a giant hole that's dug in the ground that when it rains, it would collect the rain for drinking water for the crops and for the animals and everything. And Reuben thought he could come back later and rescue Joseph. But then the plan backfired, because while he was gone, evidently the other brothers saw this group of merchants traveling by, and they decided that instead of killing Joseph, they were going to sell him to this group of merchants as a slave. And in order to cover up what they've done, they take that colorful coat that their father had given him, and they dipped it in animal blood so that when they presented it to their father, it would look like he was attacked and killed by a wild animal. And the plan worked. Jacob thought he had just lost his son. Meanwhile, the merchants have gone on to Egypt, and they've sold Joseph to another man named Potiphar, and he was the captain of the guard for the Pharaoh, that would have been a high-ranking position. So in a very short period of time, Joseph goes from daddy's favorite to a slave in a foreign land at the age of 17. Now, that's a tough couple days. I don't care who you are. That's a tough couple days right there, all right? Imagine what kinds of questions and thoughts had to be racing through his mind as all of this is unfolding in his life. And where in the world is God in the midst of that kind of disappointment and difficulty? Where is he? And as we look at Joseph's story and we think about what life was like back then, we are reminded that what? Say it with me. Even when God feels far away, he is always by your side. God didn't leave Joseph when all of this was taking place. This is what it tells us in Genesis 39. What does it say? The Lord was what? With Joseph, so that he prospered. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything that he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and he became his attendant. Now, some of you might be thinking, if God was really with Joseph, he wouldn't have allowed any of this to happen in the first place. And from a small picture view, from a lower story perspective, that would make sense. But we have to always remember that God always sees the big picture as well. He always sees the upper story, and he alone is able to use our events and our actions to accomplish his upper story. So God didn't leave Joseph. In reality, he was working through Joseph, and he was working through Joseph's circumstances to accomplish something that was much greater than Joseph's freedom. So all things considered at this point, things started going well in his life for Joseph. God was blessing everything in Potiphar's household because of Joseph, and Joseph was put in charge of everything, and finally it seemed like he was starting to catch a break. And then she happened. The Bible tells us that Joseph was a well-built and handsome young man, and Potiphar's wife evidently felt the same way. And she starts trying to seduce him. Every time he's around, she puts in her love song mix CD. Little Huey Lewis, The Power of Love. Little Captain and Tennille, Love Will Keep Us Together. But it wasn't working, so she had to crank it up. She had to put in song mix CD number 2. Had to pull out a little bit of Foreigner, I Want to Know What Love Is. A little bit of Whitney Houston, I Will Always Love You. But nothing was working. No matter what she tried, it didn't work. He continued to refuse her. Day after day, she tried to get him to come to bed with her, but he said, how could I do such a wicked and sinful thing to my God? And what we see in Joseph's life right now is a lot of disappointment. He had these big dreams, but now he's a slave. He had a family, but now he has nobody. But in the midst of his disappointment, Joseph chooses to continue to trust in God, and God honors that choice. And what happens for many people is that they have a tendency to allow disappointment to justify disobedience. You hear what I'm saying? And that can be our tendency as well. We allow disappointment to justify disobedience. People start thinking, look, God isn't holding up his end of the deal. After all, look at what's going on in my life. Look at what has happened to me. And because God has let me down over here, I'm going to do what I want to do over here. And we end up using disappointment to justify our disobedience. But Joseph chose to be obedient to God, even in the midst of terrible situation. So certainly he's due for a break now, right? I mean, it's got to happen, right? Not yet. When she doesn't get her way with Joseph, Potiphar's wife accuses him of rape, and he's thrown into prison. Young kid, who apparently before had it all, becomes a slave, and now he's a prisoner. Surely God has left him now. Genesis 39. But while Joseph was there in the prison, what's it say? The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and he granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all of those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. God continued to be with Joseph, even in the midst of circumstances that you and I would never choose for someone. And Joseph chose to continue to trust God. And God continued to use the difficulties of Joseph's lower story experience to work towards his upper story purposes. And as we continue to listen to Joseph telling his story, we discover that God has given Joseph the ability to interpret other people's dreams for them. And in his time in jail, 2 officials of the Pharaoh who had been thrown in prison, they had dreams, and Joseph interpreted them accurately, and his interpretations came true for each of them. So 2 years later, the Pharaoh himself has this troubling dream that none of his advisors can interpret. And the official who had been in prison with Joseph but had since been restored, just as Joseph had interpreted, he remembered Joseph's ability to interpret dreams, and he told the Pharaoh about it. So the Pharaoh sends for Joseph, and Joseph listens to his dream. And God showed Joseph that the dream was predicting that the next 7 years there would be bumper crops, but then the following 7 years would be years of great famine in the land. So Joseph advised the Pharaoh to put a wise man in charge of storing up the extra crops over the next 7 years so that people would have food during the 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph that he made him that guy. He made him second in command over the entire land. That's quite a promotion from a prisoner. And at age 30, it only took 13 years from when he was first sold into slavery by his brothers. Now let's jump forward about 9 years. Joseph is now 39 years old, and he had successfully stored up enough food during the 7 years of prosperity to help feed the people of Egypt, and the drought is now 2 years old. In fact, they had stored up so much food that even people from surrounding nations were coming to Egypt to purchase food for their families. And Joseph's father, Jacob, he had heard about this abundance of food in Egypt, so he sent all of his sons, except for Benjamin, the youngest, to get some food. And when they arrived, they didn't recognize Joseph. After all, it had been 22 years since they last saw him. But Joseph recognized them. Can you imagine the flood of memories and emotions that must have swept over him as he was suddenly standing face to face with his brothers again after all of this time? What would your reaction have been? Joseph pretends to not know them, and he accuses them of being spies from another country trying to figure out what Egypt's weaknesses are. And when Joseph discovers that there's a younger brother at home, one that wouldn't have even been born yet when he had been born into slavery, he kept one of the brothers as a prisoner until the others returned home and brought back that youngest brother, Benjamin. And the brothers feared that trying to bring back Benjamin would be the death of their father, but in the end, empty bellies prevailed. And they returned with the youngest brother. And eventually Joseph can't take it anymore, and he makes himself known to his brothers. This is what it says in Genesis 45. It says, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt." Imagine their response to that. Oh. Right? Probably in about that order and that speed, right? Oh no. And now, do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will still be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. In a moment of complete clarity, Joseph got a glimpse of the big picture of God. He had a light bulb moment. He realized there had been a plan all along behind the circumstances and the difficulties that he had endured for so many years. While his lower story experience had included being a slave, a prisoner, and a top leader of a nation, God had been using him to preserve the nation that he was building for himself. Because after all, you can't have a nation of people if they all end up starving to death. Don't we all love it when we have those moments when we get a glimpse of what God is doing in the bigger picture? Don't we love that? When we see that he was there all along, we just lost sight of him for a little bit. Unfortunately, for so many, it usually only happens in hindsight, if at all. But there was a trust that Joseph had in his God throughout his ordeal that allowed him to lean into the difficulties, trusting that God would be faithful and would accomplish what he was wanting to accomplish through him. If only we could have that type of faith. Joseph revisits this truth later on when his father dies, because some of the brothers fear that he only spared them for the sake of their father, and now that the father was dead, Joseph would certainly want some revenge. But because Joseph had leaned into the process that God had taken him through, he had been genuinely able to forgive his brothers and see the big picture of God at work in his life and in the world around him. This is what he said to them after their father died as they feared retaliation. Genesis 50. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph could have chosen revenge against his brothers, but through his life experiences, he had gained a humility and generosity that he couldn't have gained any other way. Do you hear me on that? There are things that you are going to go through, and because God loves you more than anybody else does, because God knows you better than anybody else does, he's going to allow you to go through some things, because that is the only way that he's going to work something into you, and the only way he might work something out of you. Does that land with you? And when we see it from that perspective, it changes. When we have that kind of trust, when we have that kind of faith in our God, then we're able to follow the example of Joseph, and we trust during the circumstances. And some of us need to learn how to do that, because too many of us, we only see how God was working in hindsight. We look back on it and we're like, oh, that's what God was doing. But when we have faith in a big, big God who always sees the upper story, who is always with us, it allows us to have faith in the circumstances, not just after the fact. Suffering has this purifying effect on our character and our motives. It knocks out the arrogance, it knocks out the selfishness, and it puts humility and generosity in their place. We gain humility through life experience, don't we? We know young people that we see with tremendous talent. How many of you know a young person with tremendous talent, tremendous skills, but absolutely no humility? We all do. Because we were those kids when we were that age too, right? Tremendous talent, skills. They don't know how to be humble. They just know how to be talented. You guys know I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. How many of you are just football fans? So if I just say Le'Veon Bell, you know what I'm talking about. All right. Guy's been holding out all year long because the franchise tag of $14.5 million for this year wasn't enough. So he's been holding out. And he's just like one of those ones that I think of. I'm like, here you got this young kid, extremely talented, all kinds of skill, absolutely no humility whatsoever. It's all hey, it's all about me thing here. And we all know that. And a lot of us were that when we were that age too, right? Some of us, maybe we're still there. All right, we just got to be honest about it. And you hope that in another 20 years of life experience, you'll be more shaped and more humble and more generous as you go through life. It's one of the main reasons that when I see arrogance in somebody, the first thing I do is I pray to God for brokenness. I don't do that to be mean. I just pray, God, this person needs to understand. This person needs to get a clue about who you are and where you need to be in their life, where you are in the pecking order and where they are in the pecking order. And a lot of times it just takes coming to a place of brokenness. Something needs to happen in their life or something needs to happen in their heart or mind so that they start getting the big picture. So they start seeing the upper story, not just their little lower story perspective. It's why I encourage people to embrace suffering and pain instead of just asking God to take it away or for God to give them the easy path. That's not an easy thing to do, is it? How many of us naturally just say, hey, thank you, God, for this pain. Thank you for these difficult circumstances. I'm so grateful. No. But when we follow the example of Joseph, this is what we remember. God doesn't waste our time. God doesn't waste our heartache. God doesn't waste our pain. James 1, verse 2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. That's what we want. That's what God wants for us, is that no matter what happens in life, we know that he is there. Say this line with me one last time that we've been going through today. Even when God feels far away, he is always by your side. Some of you need to hear that today because you're going through something. And the reality is, if you're just being honest about it, you got some doubts. You're wondering, where is God? And if God loved me, why would he allow this to happen? If God loved me, if God cared about me, why would he allow these circumstances to happen? Why would he allow this to happen in my marriage? Why would he allow this to happen with my kids? Why would he allow this to happen with my job? And the list goes on and on and on. We have those areas in our lives where it doesn't really feel like God is very present right now. And we remember, even when God feels far away, he is always by our side. And whatever you're going through right now, God is not wasting that. So change your prayer from God coming in and just making everything easy to saying, all right, God, I'm trusting that if you're allowing me to stay in this, you've got a purpose for this. You're not wasting this. You're not wasting this time. So help me to lean into this. Help me to trust you. Help me to pray the right way. Help me to ask the right questions, so that when I get through this, I can say, you know what? I trusted God every step of the way. And look how he showed up. Even when God feels far away, he is always by your side. Would you go ahead and stand as we go into this closing song? I love this song. One thing remains. And the verses in that, I want you to think about the circumstances in your life. Is there an area in your life where you're just being honest and going, God, this is an area I just feel like you haven't been very present in. And I want you to think about that as we're singing this song. That no matter what's going on, I love these words from this one thing remains. His love never fails. It never gives up. It never runs out on me. Let that be your prayer this morning. Allow God to speak into your heart. Allow him to speak into your mind. Allow him to speak into your situation. And you lean in. Trust. Larry, can we put up that last slide of that last song again? Do we believe this? When we think about God, do we believe your love is never ending? Your love is never failing. Let's pray. God, we are here together today, being reminded once again that your love never fails, that you love us more than anybody else possibly could, that you have a greater plan for our lives than anybody else possibly could give us. But God, the reality is we get caught up in our own stuff. We get caught up in our own day-to-day grind and we lose sight of the bigger picture that you've told us to focus on. We get caught up in the day-to-day grind and we just get this lower story perspective going. And we need reminded like we were today, God, that you have this amazing upper story perspective and you give us glimpses into that. And we see it in the story of Joseph that we looked at today. That even though he was caught up in the day-to-day circumstances of being daddy's favorite, of being a slave, of being a prisoner, of being second in command, as he was caught up in the day-to-day lower story of that, you saw the big upper story picture all along. And you don't waste our time. You don't waste our circumstances. You don't waste our pain. And God, I know there are people here today that needs to settle in to the deepest parts of their soul because they're struggling. There's something going on in their life right now where they feel like you're distant, where they don't feel like you're hearing them, where they don't feel like you're present with them. And that's just a lie from the enemy, God, because you are always with us. You are always for us. And I pray that you would help us to pray differently because of knowing that truth, that our prayers shouldn't always be for the easy way out. Because the reality is, God, we'd rather go through the difficult times knowing you are right there with us than go the easy route without you. So help us to lean in. Help us to trust. Help us to follow the example of Joseph. Help us to continue to recognize that we are common people, but you are an uncommon, amazing, huge, big, upper story perspective God, and we love you for that. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. If you'd like some prayer this morning, our prayer team will be over here in the corner. Anybody have questions about what's going on with us? Love to talk to you about that as well. You guys have an awesome week. Last week of WOW is Wednesday, so hopefully we'll see a lot of you there.